I am thrilled to welcome you all to our fall forum, Healthy Minds, Living Long, Being Well. Now more than ever, we need to know how to keep our minds and our bodies resilient so that we can live fulfilling, productive, healthier, and longer lives. AccessCircles is a network providing the highest level of access and information on women's health, wealth, and well-being. This wonderful forum will feature 3 leading experts on brain health, mindfulness, and aging: Dr. Richie Davidson, Dr. Lisa Mosconi, and Dr. David Sinclair. Right now, women across the country are struggling with uncertainty created by the current pandemic, both for our health and our economy. Many have had their work, projects, and livelihoods put on hold, and many are burning the candle at both ends to work from home, while also serving as a remote learning teacher to their children and taking on additional caregiving roles. Challenges, I think, to our mental health are skyrocketing, not just this is documented, while the pandemic has made it more difficult for many people to access help and care. Our topic today is so important and timely, and everyone needs to be equipped with the tools for cultivating a healthy mind. So today, for the first time ever, we're broadcasting an Access Circles event on Facebook Live. We're doing this through WHAM, which is an initiative of Access Circles that is 100% focused on increasing awareness of women's health issues, ending the inequities and bias in medical research, and accelerating scientific discovery that supports women's health. WHAM reminds us that we need access to information that's specific and relevant to women, as we are different from men down to the cellular level. For more information about WHAM, please visit whamnow.org. And I will be delighted to introduce WHAM's Global Chair, Meryl Comer, who will be interviewing Dr. Lisa Mosconi, as well as hosting our dialogue with Dr. Mosconi and Dr. Davidson. But now I am thrilled and so appreciative, David, to welcome you to this forum. David is one of the world's most famous scientists and entrepreneurs, best known for understanding why we age and how to reverse it. He's a New York Times bestselling author, a tenured professor of genetics, and co-director of the Paul F. Glenn Center for the Biology of Aging Research at Harvard. He's best known for his work on genes and small molecules that delay aging, including their sirtuin genes, resveratrol, and NAD precursors. If you have questions, which I'm sure you'll have many for David, please send them through the Zoom question and answer link at the bottom of the page. From 10:30 to 10:45, we'll host a Q&A session and answer as many questions as we have. But most importantly, David, I can't tell you how appreciative I am that you are joining us today. We had just the best time in Palm Beach, and we so welcome you into our community. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Carolee, and thank you everybody who's joining this morning. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is not really my library. This is a fake library. I'm actually in my basement, which is the only quiet place in my home. Yeah, so today I have just a short amount of time to tell you about some new work that we've been doing. For those of you who really don't know anything about my lab's work or about the field of aging research, I'm here to tell you that the field has come a long way in the last 20 years. We started out studying little organisms like yeast cells and worms. Through the 2000s, a lot of us, myself included, we worked on mice, and now we're at a place where, in a time where there are dozens of human clinical trials using the discoveries out of the aging field to treat diseases of aging. Because while we give names to various diseases, Alzheimer's, various dementias, cancer, heart disease, frailty, etc., really we're just naming the effects of aging, right? To give you an example, the one I like is cancer. If you smoke, you increase your chances of lung cancer by 5-fold. By aging, you increase it more than 100-fold. So, you know, the aging really is something that we've neglected for many, many centuries, actually. And unfortunately, in our society, because we could never do anything about it, because we really didn't understand it the way we do now, we've tended to look at aging, the aging brain, the aging organs, as really just something that happens naturally. And when it happens naturally, unfortunately, we tend to think of it as acceptable. But I'm here to tell you, A, we can do something about it, and B, it's not acceptable to be sick in old age. Let me just turn on my light a little bit brighter. You might be able to see me. There you go. Now you can really see my age. All right, so Carolee, it's okay if I start some slides and share those?
Yes, of course.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, here it is. Great. Are you seeing that okay, Caroline?
Yep, perfect.
All right. Some disclosures down there. There's a full list of who I work with at that website. Yeah, unfortunately, the aging research field gets a lot of negative attention, and that's mainly because there's a lot of people who claim they know about aging, and they're selling things that they claim to slow aging, and almost all of it is not based on real science. We've come a long way since the days of antioxidants. We actually now have a whole set of genes that we understand in humans control how long we live and how susceptible we are to those diseases that I mentioned as a result. And so the science that I'm going to tell you about, and those of my colleagues, which I won't have time to mention, unfortunately, though there are hundreds of them around the world, their work is being published in the world's leading journals. There are journals like Cell, Science, Nature, and there's at least a dozen more that I could mention. These are journals that are considered real breakthroughs that change the way we think about biology. Up there with discovering a new planet and new physics. The science of aging is up there with those and is considered one of the hottest areas of science today. And I want to share with you some of the breakthroughs that have been made in my lab just recently. And you're actually hearing about this just maybe a few weeks ahead of some of the work that's going to be published in one of these top 3 journals. So I'll give you a sneak preview of that. And so traditionally, and I would say most people that you would talk to, including doctors, think of aging as something distinct from age-related diseases. And as I've started to tell you, that's actually just factually wrong. The only real difference between these two is that we give them different names. In reality, what's going on is that aging drives age-related diseases. We don't get dementia typically when we're a teenager, right? There's a good reason for that. And finally, we're starting to understand why we get these diseases late in life and not early in life, right? We take it for granted that this happens, but has anyone really asked why is it that these diseases occur late in life and not so often early in life? And I think the pandemic that we're experiencing really highlights the fact that there are a lot of differences between young and old, men and women, and that if we were able to either delay or in some cases reverse the clock of aging, then we literally wouldn't have a pandemic. And so aging is a really important topic. And there's a real revolution in the field going on that you may not have heard about. And that's why I appreciate the chance to give seminars such as this one, because if it's filtered through the media, and newspapers are often the biggest culprit here, they take our research and they just hype it or they misinterpret it. And the public who doesn't have access to scientists, or at least until recently didn't, really has no idea what the truth is and what's good science, what's bad science. So I'm happy to update you directly. So what I want to cover really in the next half an hour is answering these questions. What is aging? Not just what does it look like? We know what it looks like, but what is it at the molecular level? What drives it? Can we measure it accurately? And can we even slow it? And then really what I want to focus on is the new science of aging, which is showing that at least in the lab and in model animals such as mice, it's actually surprisingly easy to reverse aging. If I had said that phrase 10 years ago, I would have been probably kicked out of Harvard, or at least laughed out of a room. But I can now say this with not just a straight face, but proudly, that we are in my lab and a few others around the world showing that you can reverse aging, period. Now, this is one of the more complicated slides I'll show, but it's very important. We as life forms have enormous plasticity. So what do I mean by that? Well, it was discovered by John Gordon, well, going back in the 1970s, that if you take the nucleus, the DNA, out of an adult and put it into an egg, in this case, he was using tadpoles and frog eggs. But it's true, we know we can now clone pretty much any animal we want. What he showed is that you can reverse aging. You can reset the clock and start life fresh. Now, this isn't really what we want to do for ourselves. It's not going to cure Alzheimer's disease easily. We can't just take the brain out and restart a fresh brain and put it back into you. That's science fiction. But we're doing something similar to that now in my lab, and that's what I want to tell you about. And our research is based on this second line here, cellular reprogramming. And Shinya Yamanaka, a Japanese scientist, going back now over a decade ago, showed that if you add a certain number of genes into adult cells, they might be a skin cell from you, or really any cell you can take from an adult, you can reprogram those to be stem cells. We call these iPSCs, or induced pluripotent stem cells. And it's a real revolution, because now we can do things like take a skin sample or just a spit sample, grow those cells and make mini organs or stem cells that we can put back in the brain, and hopefully regenerate parts of the aging brain, as well as skin and other tissues. And Shinya Yamanaka and John Gordon both together won the Nobel Prize for those discoveries in 2012. Other things worth mentioning are that other life forms can regrow parts of their body very easily and are immortal. Hydra can do that. It's a very tiny little waterborne organism. Axolotls or salamanders, you cut their limbs off, their hands off, they can regrow those. And we can even regrow large amounts of our liver. The majority of our liver will grow back if we take it out, which is great for people who lose part of their liver. But what it's also great is it tells us that the ability to regenerate and be young again is still in our body. We just need to tap into that mechanism. And I think we may finally have figured out how to do that. But first, let me talk about one leading hypothesis as to why we age. Now, in deference to my colleagues, there are a lot of ideas about why we grow old, but we do believe that the same mechanisms that cause the liver to age and our skin to age are the same underlying processes that cause the brain to age. So if we can understand the causes of aging, it will have a universal benefit to all diseases of aging. That's really what drives us. And one of the leading hypotheses is the following. So this is a representation on the left of a young nucleus, and the black lines are DNA. You can see them under the microscope as chromosomes. And there are proteins that bind to chromosomes and switch genes off. And then here there's a gene that's being read by the cell. That gene is switched on. And that's great. That keeps a young cell functional. It can divide, it can grow. If it's a nerve cell, if it's very young, it can even regenerate. And in fish and in mice, well, typically fish, you can damage the eye, for example, and it will grow back parts of the eye. And we don't have that function anymore as we get older, but a very young baby still has some of that capacity. And the idea is to find out why that happens. And what we think is going on as we get older is that nerve cells and other cells in the body, they lose this nice pattern of what we call gene expression, such that genes that should be off in this particular cell, let's say it's a nerve cell, will start to come on. And conversely, genes that should be on to make that nerve cell a nerve cell will get switched off. And so what you get is a loss of identity. The cell doesn't realize anymore that it's a nerve cell. And no wonder the brain doesn't function efficiently if the genes that it needs to function are not turned on and off correctly anymore. And one of the questions we've had is, does this occur? The answer is yes. But is it an effect of aging or is it a cause of aging? And we can actually test that in the lab. And what we wanted to do was to drive this process. And if we're right about this, we should get acceleration of aging. Now, we don't want to do that to a person, of course. That's really the last thing that we want to do, of course. But we can do this in the lab. And I want to give you one of those experiments, a demonstration. One of the analogies I like to use is a compact disc. Now, when I teach at Harvard, I have to explain what a compact disc is. But I think most of us will know that this is a digital format of music and movies. But they used to get scratched pretty badly. And then the reader would skip, similar to a broken record. And what we're talking about here is the biological equivalent of polishing that CD, that compact disc, so that we could recover the youthful music of our lives and get the body to function like it's young again. And really what it boils down to is my hypothesis, and some of my colleagues agree, is that aging isn't a loss of genetic information. The music is still there, but the scratches occur so that the body cannot read that information correctly, which is good news because you can polish the CD, but if you break a piece of the CD off, you're not going to get the information back. For modern times, it's similar to rebooting the hard drive or the memory, the RAM, and get the software to upload again. That's really what we're trying to do for the body. And we now think that that's actually possible, that there is a memory of an unpolished CD in our cells, and we can press reboot. So just a little bit of biology with some, this is a metaphor for how our cells package our DNA. What we do in every cell so that we can fit 6 feet of DNA into every cell is that it's wrapped up tightly in these spools. Now, these are, of course, not plastic black things. These are actually histone proteins that package up the DNA. And when you have very tight packaging, the gene that will be switched off and remain off. But if you open up in a nice, beautiful loop, let's say here as shown, maybe here, this little bit of loop here, this could be a gene that is switched on. Now the cell has access to that DNA molecule and can, what we call, express it. What we think is going on during aging is that this becomes untangled and messed up, and so that the cell doesn't read the DNA the right way. So the way the cell actually does this is more realistic representation of how DNA looks in the cell. If you could go in there, you've got these histone packing proteins, and the DNA wraps around it about 2.5 times. And this, if you fold it up layer upon layer, which you can see happening over on the top left, eventually will give you a chromosome, which you can see under the microscope. It's not, you can't see DNA molecules under the microscope, but we know it's there, of course. And the way the cell, one of the ways the cell packages up the DNA tightly to turn a gene off is to add a chemical called a methyl. And the process is called methylation. And methyls are everywhere. They're in most drugs. It's just a hydrogen atom with 3 carbons attached. But the cell uses this chemical modification to tell a cell that it should be a particular type of cell. Let's talk about the neuron. The neuron, when you're young, becomes a neuron, and it has to stay that neuron in your brain for the next up to 120 years. And one of the ways that it does that is this chemical methyl gets attached to the DNA and stays there. But one of the things we're finding is that this pattern of methyls on different parts of the genome, on different genes, changes over time. And we actually think this is one of the underlying reasons we get old. One of the reasons we believe this is work thanks to really a couple of leading labs, Stephen Horvath and Greg Hanna, who showed about 7 to 10 years ago that you can read these methyl groups with machines and derive with artificial intelligence an age of the body. And it depends on the pattern that you have at the time. And we can do this for animals and we can do it for people. If I took your blood, I could quite easily do what's called a DNA methylation clock analysis. And I could tell you that where you are for your birthday candles might be misleading. You might be, well, you might be average, but you might be older for your actual chronological age, or your biological age may be younger than your chronological age based on this clock. And we believe that this is an indication of true biological age, because we can also use this number to predict when you're going to die. And it's surprisingly accurate. Now, if you don't exercise, you don't do the good things. So you don't exercise, if you don't eat well, you're always full, you've put on too much weight, or you smoke, you actually will, on average, if you look at a population, see an increased rate of aging of this clock, and vice versa. So this doesn't prove that it causes aging, but it's a really good indicator of the rate of aging. And there are actually a few companies popping up that can measure this for you. But getting back to the cause and effect, we wanted to cause the scratches on this compact disc and see if you get aging. Now, this is a mouse that we didn't scratch. It's 16 months old, which is a late middle-aged mouse in my lab. And we had a way to scratch the CD. What we did was we broke the chromosome at different places when the mouse was young, 5 months old, let them heal, and then asked, did that change the structure of those loops and bundles that I talked about? And the answer was yes. We could change what we call the epigenome, which is those bundles and loops. And we got a mouse that looked like this. Now remember, these mice have the same genome, same DNA, but one has accelerated aging. And this mouse and hundreds of them, they're the same age as their siblings, but they undergo this rapid aging. And we've looked at the molecular level, histological level, and even the DNA methylation clock. And these mice are definitely older by about 50%. So can you reset the clock is the question. What if you could hit a button and make the brain young, or make that mouse look young again? It would be the equivalent of taking the DNA that's all untangled and putting it back to this structure. A pretty difficult job, right? And we've been working on this for many, many years to try and figure out how to do it. But we stood on the shoulders of Shinya Yamanaka, the Nobel Prize winner. And I also here want to give public credit to Juan Carlos Belmonte, who's at the Salk Institute, who did a study that's remarkable. He turned on the Yamanaka genes, those 4 genes that I talked about, that would normally make a stem cell. He turned them on in a sick mouse and made it live 40% longer. And it seemed to be rejuvenation when he did that. Now, the problem was that the mice would, if he turned them on for more than 2 days a week, they died. So this is not going to be a medicine anytime soon. But it was an interesting proof of principle that you might be able to perhaps improve health and maybe turn back the clock. Now, what I'm going to tell you about are some experiments in nerve cells. We chose to work on the nervous system because while adult neurons don't grow very well, break your spine, damage your eye, or your brain, it's not going to grow back well. But young brains do, young eyes do. And we thought if we could reprogram, in this case, we're going to talk about the back of the eye, part of the central nervous system. If we could reprogram that to be young, we might be able to regrow the optic nerve and even regain vision in old mice. So we did that experiment. This is Shinya Yamanaka at the night he won the Nobel Prize with royalty in Sweden. So let's get back to this point here, is that Shinya showed that, Dr. Yamanaka showed that you could put these genes into an adult cell, these 4 genes, which I abbreviate O, S, K, and M, and get these stem cells. Now, what are these genes? Well, they make proteins that tell other genes what to do. They tell other genes either to switch on or switch off. So we call these transcription factors. They're basically central coordinating gene control protein producing genes. All right, so these can reset the age of a cell back to 0, but we don't want to reset our bodies back to 0, or we'd have a giant tumor, or we'd die. So we wanted to find a way to do this safely. And a graduate student in the lab, Wancheng Lu, who's now graduated, found that this particular combination of 3 genes, leaving out this MYC gene, was the winning combination. It's seemingly very safe, and it doesn't cause tumors. This was the bad actor here. So we put these genes into animals, and we're going to be putting them hopefully into patients within the next couple of years using what's called an adeno-associated virus. Now, it's not related to coronavirus, but it does look similar, as you can tell. And it's a very safe and FDA-approved way of doing gene therapy. And these viruses are used currently to treat sickle cell anemia and reverse genetic diseases, such as diseases that cause vision loss. And it's working really well. And so we took this virus, we put our 3-gene reprogramming combo into it, and now we could infect the eye and see what would happen. And so what we did with the mice was we damaged the optic nerve. This is in another lab, actually collaborated with Jigang He's lab at Children's Hospital. And Jigang's goal is to help with spinal injury. And this is a way of testing that. So if you don't treat the optic nerve, what happens is the nerves will die back. And you can see here that the dye in orange doesn't flow down these dead nerves. But what we did with our virus, we could now turn on these, what we hoped were anti-aging factors. And if we were right, we should get regrowth. And so we hit the jackpot with this experiment. Turning on the reprogramming, turns out, did reverse the age of these nerve cells. It didn't cause any safety issues. We don't get tumors. But we do get the regrowth of these nerves from the eye back to the brain. And the longer we leave it, the better they grow and the further they grow. And so you can also see that the nerves that were close to the eye were preserved much better than those that weren't treated. So this was a first Hail Mary experiment. We went on to test glaucoma. Again, we're putting in viruses after we've created what's called intraocular pressure, or pressure in the eye. So this is our mouse model of glaucoma done with Bruce Cassandra's lab in Boston. And now we can test, can you not just restore the electrical signals in the eye, but can you actually get physical, functional vision back in a mouse that has become blind? And we did this for 4 weeks, and we had a look at the function. First of all, we did get the electrical signals back. This is before turning on the reprogramming and after. We have shown that this is due to an age reversal process. And we can test vision. What we do is we put a mouse in front of moving lines in an LCD screen. And if the mouse moves its head, we can tell that it can actually see those lines. And we can test how well it can see by changing these lines' thickness. And what you can see in this early experiment that we did with Bruce was that we got vision back. This is without treatment, and this is with treatment. So some of these mice actually got all of their vision back, and some got an intermediate amount of their vision back. But this is the first time that we've actually been, or anyone's been able to reverse vision loss in this model of glaucoma. So I wanted to know, what about regular old mice? Can we reverse aging in the old eye? And this is also, I hope you can appreciate, a surrogate for what we could do for the brain as well, because we're talking about rejuvenating neurons. Now, this was an old mouse that couldn't see. It's not moving its head. It's essentially blind. But we could take a different mouse and we could turn on the reprogramming factors. You might ask, well, David, how do you turn on this reprogramming? Well, we just give an antibiotic. We give doxycycline, which you can take for, resistance to malaria. You can take it for an upset gut. It's pretty benign. And we've engineered the virus so that the antibiotic turns it on. So we do this now for 3 to 4 weeks in old mice. And I think you can probably guess what we saw. We had blind mice seeing again. Now, excuse the little droplets, that happens naturally as the mouse sit there. But the important point is that this mouse is now moving its head. The nerves at the back of the eye are now young again, and they're functional. So those neurons in the eye, I can tell you, we've proven that those nerves remember again that they should be nerves. And in the old animal, they had forgotten how to be nerves. So this is pretty exciting, right? That we can take quite a complex tissue, arguably one of the most complex tissues in the body, the eye, turn back the clock by about 70 to 80% from what it was. These mice, if you're wondering, are 1 year of age. We take it back to a few months of age. And it works again, just like they were young. And what we believe, my colleagues and I, is that we can reprogram other parts of the body, the brain, the spleen, the kidney, the liver. So the field is just beginning, and some of the unpublished work that I was hearing about at a recent conference said that it's possible to reverse possibly all parts of the body. Now, this is a mouse. We don't know if it's going to translate into people, but we're really optimistic because these factors that we're using are already in the clinic for other purposes, such as using them to make stem cells. And we know that this system works in human cells. We've done that in my lab. We can take human neurons, damage them, and fix them with this system and make them regrow. So this is, a bit of tongue-in-cheek. This was a cartoon that was made after Belmonte's paper came out a few years ago. And the idea is that we could perhaps, for the first time, have a handle on not just why we age, but doing something about it. So this is a group of people that I took from a nursing home and reprogrammed them. I jest, this is actually my lab members. They're just fantastic, and it's been a joy to work with them. And really just, I have one of the best jobs in the world mentoring these folks who, many of them will go on to be leaders in their own right. I do want to point out a couple of people. Where's Wan Cheng? Where is he? Don't tell me he's not in this photo. He might not be. So Wan Cheng Lu, fantastic guy. He's not here in the photo, unfortunately. Oh no, there he is. Excuse me. He was right up the back. There he is. Also, Daniel did bioinformatic work. And then Xiao Tian, who I can honestly say isn't in this photo, did a lot of work as well. We've got Maeve, who helped a lot as well. And Carolina is also a co-author on this paper. Oh, Alice. Yeah, excuse me, I threw this photo in at the last minute, but Alice is our mouse wrangler. So a lot of the mouse experiments looking at the ability to reverse aging of the immune system and mice running better with some of our other experiments. Alice has been great for that. And thanks to everybody in the lab. So what can you do? Just in the last few moments, I know if we have time for questions, there's going to be a lot of them about this. If there's one thing that you can do of all the things that I think are possible, it would be to eat less often. Now, of course, this isn't about malnutrition. It's not about, certainly not about teenagers eating less. That's not the point, and I would hate to give that impression. It's about people who are my age, I'm 51, whose metabolism has slowed down, and we're still inclined to eat 3 meals a day with snacks, and I think that that's a mistake. And we've known for millennia, actually, that skipping meals is actually beneficial. So I skip breakfast. Some people prefer to skip late dinners, but I think it's scientifically proven now that we do overeat in our society, and those civilizations, and well, cities at least, that abstain once in a while actually do have healthier lives and live longer. So that's one tip. There's quite a few. I wrote a book because I often don't have time to talk about what to do. It's this book. If you want to pick it up, you're welcome to. It's out since about a year ago. And if you don't want to read the book, you can actually just skip to page 304, which is the cheat sheet for what I think is worth considering to have a long, healthy lifespan. It's, I do what I say. A lot of these things I'm doing myself, in part because I think it would be hypocritical to advise to do things and not do them myself, but also because I'm a scientist and I'm monitoring myself as time goes on. I've been doing it for about 15 years. And so far, so good. If I see anything dangerous, I'll let everybody know, but so far I'm doing well health-wise. And so is my father, by the way, who's 81. So Carolee, I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, David, thank you. I mean, I so enjoy always and so fascinated clearly by your work. A couple of things. First of all, Lifespan is an amazing book, and I wouldn't skip to 304. Every page I thought was fantastic and insightful in terms of information that I think all of us are somewhat puzzled by, but certainly interested in. So some of your early work was in resveratrol. And I know also a couple of people have asked me about metformin and I think it's NMN. If you could talk about some of the different lotions and potions, if you will, that I know a lot of people are taking. I mean, for many years, a lot of us were fixated on HGH and some other things. So, and I'm not suggesting that I'm not recommending or suggesting that either I or others should be taking all of this, but clearly, there's been a lot of research that has shown that these are some things that might retard or slow aging or in fact reverse it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I can. First, a disclaimer, I'm a Harvard professor and I get criticized when I talk about what people should do. So I'm definitely not saying what people should do. But I do feel an obligation to educate. I know more than most about these medicines. And so I'm happy to give my scientific opinion. So let's start with metformin. Metformin has been on the market for decades. It's been in hundreds of millions of people. It's typically prescribed as a frontline medicine for type 2 diabetes or high blood sugar. And it works remarkably well. Now, it's not perfectly safe. It can have some side effects, but that's also very rare. It's a drug, so in the US and most Western countries, you need prescription. But what's been found about metformin science-wise is that if you look at over 10,000 people, their health over a number of years of taking metformin, there is apparently a protection not just against deleterious sugar levels, but also less cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and frailty in those people who are susceptible. And to me, that's really compelling. There's been a number of studies now that show this. Now, that's not proof, that's an association, of course. But given that metformin is cheap, it's on the list of the World Health Organization's essential medicines for humanity. And the risk is relatively low, especially if you do this under doctor's supervision and you monitor things. I've on occasion been taking metformin myself to see what would happen. But more importantly, I think that we need to do actual cause and effect trials under placebo-controlled conditions, which I'm helping my colleagues do, but we don't have results from that just yet. So that's metformin. You do need a prescription, and some doctors will tell you, absolutely not, I'm not going to give it to you until you get type 2 diabetes. But there are other doctors who are more sympathetic or who have read the research. So that's just a forewarning. The other thing you mentioned, Carolee, is NMN. NMN is a class of molecules called NAD precursors. I talk about them in my book extensively. We've researched them for about a decade. The way to think of these molecules is that they are the gas pedal for the sirtuins that we work on. So sirtuins are defensive enzymes against aging. We have 7 of them in our bodies. And the NAD molecules that we're taking, the precursors, they're the gas pedal. And resveratrol, which you also mentioned, no, I got that wrong. I should know this by now. So the NAD is the fuel, the gas in the tank, and the resveratrol is the accelerator pedal. And they both work on the same system, on the same proteins that defend the body. And so that's why I think the combination might be helpful. NMN is a molecule that is naturally occurring, and the body converts it into this NAD. What's NAD? Well, NAD is a molecule we need for life. We have a lot of it in our bodies, and it's used for chemical reactions, but it's also used by these sirtuin defenses that we work on as an indicator of when times are tough. When times are tough, our bodies fight disease and aging and fight against or fight for longevity. But without NAD or high levels of NAD, they don't work very well. And in fact, the older we get, in many of our tissues, the levels of NAD decline, apparently by as much as 50%, which I predict is going to be a reason why we age faster and faster as we get older, and why we are susceptible to diseases as we get older. So the idea with NMN is that we can raise those NAD levels back up, give the gas to the system that defends us. And in mice, at least, we've shown, and others, that there are remarkable rejuvenation properties in elderly mice. For example, I mentioned Alice in my lab, and others have shown that you can make mice run 50% further by giving them NMN in their water supply just for 4 weeks. And that's all published if anyone wants to check it out. It was in the journal Cell a couple of years ago. So that's NMN. Resveratrol is the molecule in red wine, which we worked on for many years. We still do a little bit of work on that, trying to tease out the minutiae about how it's actually working in the body. But we have a lot of really good evidence that one of the ways resveratrol works is this accelerated pedal on these enzymes. What do? I still take resveratrol. I've been doing that since 2004. I'm still healthy and alive. So an N of 1 clinical trials being successful, but there have been clinical trials with resveratrol. Some have shown no effect. Some have shown positive effects on things like endurance and blood sugar levels. And all trials are done different ways, of course. Sometimes the patients are older, sometimes they have obesity, and sometimes resveratrol is given with food, without food. And resveratrol tends to work in clinical trials when it's given to people who are older, might have a bit of excess body fat, and also when it's mixed with food that helps it dissolve, because resveratrol is like eating brick dust. It doesn't dissolve very well and can just pass straight through the body.
So, mix it into your yogurt?
That's what I do. Yeah. So I did that today, just to prove that I'm not making this up. I have yogurt. I like to use Greek yogurt because I find it dissolves very well in that. But because I'm trying not to eat until late lunch or dinner, it's just a couple of spoonfuls to be able to get the resveratrol into my system.
So David, you're on the cutting edge of all of this, and so you have such obviously scientific insights into it. As a layperson, obviously interested in staying useful and energetic and all these other good things, and well, how do I go about, if I say to my physician, hey, I'm really interested in NMN and I'm really interested in metformin, I think most physicians are familiar with, but some of these other formulas, they're really not. I know that there are a number of companies out there from whom I can order these products, but without medical guidance, it's not such a great idea. It doesn't matter, or there's a pretty standard dosage, or lead me down that path.
Right. Yeah, it's a can of worms.
Let's not go there.
Well, I'll say some facts. That's fine.
Okay.
I'm always happy to do that. One is, if you see my name promoting something, it's a lie. I spend tens of thousands of dollars every year trying to stop that. Just heads up on that. Don't go by my name. A lot of the claims are not true. And most of them, just say, oh, David's researched this, David's researched that. But we haven't literally proven without a doubt that, say, NMN works in people, though we are testing it right now. If you do choose to take a supplement, supplements are legal and many of them are fine. I think there's no evidence that I've seen that says NMN is going to do harm, though there's still possibility. Resveratrol, I think, is extremely safe, given that probably 1 million or more people have been taking it for a long time and nothing has shown up yet. So it's this risk reward. The older you get, the more risks you're willing to take, right? In terms of, what's going to happen if you don't do anything. So that's the calculation that I make as well. But if you do take a supplement, no matter what it is, look for the 3 letters GMP, which stands for Good Manufacturing Practices. That means that they're at least, they don't have mouse feces in their factory or whatever. So that's a start. But I would encourage you to look for products that are very pure, at least 98% pure. because some of the products and supplements can be 50% this, 50% that. And just in the case of resveratrol, 50% resveratrol, what's the other 50%? People don't know. And in fact, there's reports of people having diarrhea, and who knows what else could be happening. So those are my tips.
Two other questions. The first is, I was fascinated by the research that you're doing with the 3 blind mice. And from bench to bedside, is this in our lifetime? How quickly is this research?
Gosh, I hope so. Yeah, so I've founded a company called Life Biosciences in 2017. We have raised enough money to get through to human clinical trials in the next 2 years.
Awesome.
If it works, we'll know in a few years from now. If
Fantastic.
everything goes well, of course.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll work, knowing you. Are there commercially available tests to check the methylation age clock or our true biological clock? And is this related to telomere testing? Is it similar?
Well, similar in that they both claim to measure your true biological age. Telomeres are more variable, and I would say, my scientific opinion, not as accurate as this new clock, the methylation clock, but they're both helpful. Telomeres, you might all recall, are the ends of the chromosomes that get shorter and shorter as we get older. There are companies that have these tests. I don't have them listed in my brain, but if you Google Horvath or DNA methylation clock, I'm sure you'll find them. And yeah, these have only been around for a year or two. I can't vouch for them, but I'm keen, out of curiosity, to test how I'm doing. I'm sure many of you are. There's one company, and again, in conflict of interest sakes, I do work with this company. It's called Inside Tracker, and I talk about it in my book. I've been having blood tests from them. They can come to your kitchen. You can go to LabCorp or Quest and get a blood test every few months, or every year if you want. And there they do an extensive blood workup that I also share with my doctor. And it's been very useful to track things over time, so I can see what's working and what isn't, or if something's having an adverse effect. And what they also offer that I found useful, and this is not a sell job, this is just me trying to be educational, is that they compare you to hundreds of thousands of other people and tell you whether you're out of range or not for your demographic, your gender, which is often not done by doctors, and also advice on how to correct things that are out of whack.
I feel like I'm on my Peloton. I know that you track your biomarkers. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, listen, I could talk to you, for hours, and we did say that we'd come up to Boston. The last time I saw you clearly was at the beginning of this pandemic, in a much more beautiful setting, although your setting with your library is fabulous, knowing that it's your basement. I still am very eager to come visit your lab and bring a group of all of us who are so fascinated and interested in the work that you're doing. And we're just so supportive of your willingness to share it with us. And we know that there is always controversial information that's out there, but we're relying on you, David. Look at what you've done with your dad, which is amazing. So I'm going to rely on you for that. And I'm getting close to him, so in age. So you're on my list to be in touch with. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak and to educate. Happy to do it anytime.
I'm so delighted. Well, we'll make sure that you are already part of our stable. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you really soon. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sounds good. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing a dear friend, Richie Davidson, who also happened to be with us in Palm Beach this past February. We can't get enough of all of you. And these half-hour sound bites are obviously not fulfilling enough. And Richie, as many of you know, is a very renowned professor of psychology and psychiatry, and founder and the director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin. We won't get into Wisconsin right now, but I hope things are better there, Richie, than what I've been reading. I'm not going to read all of Richie's bio, since all of you know how extensive it is and that he's published so many books and over 400 articles, because I know that you want to hear from him. And after his presentation, instead of directly into Q&A, Dr. Lisa Mosconi will offer her presentation, and then Meryl will host a dialogue between Richie and Lisa. We set it up this way, for several reasons. We really wanted Richie and Lisa to meet. Richie's been very seminal in terms of studying the brains of monks very early while they were meditating. Lisa is very focused on estrogen in women's brains. We think there might, not that there's a connection between the monks and estrogen, but that there might be something for us to be talking about in terms of, we know how different our brains are, and we thought each of you would bring a very unique perspective. So Richie, with that, I again, thank you for sharing all of the incredible ways that we can change our minds and habits to improve our well-being, because I know that you're able to do that. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Carolee. It really is a delight and honor to be here. And I really am inspired by all that you are doing and the amazing people you're bringing to the attention of so many others. So it's great. And I'm really happy to share a little bit this morning with all of you about some of our work. We think of well-being as a skill. That really is the punchline, and everything else that I'm will describe is a footnote to that. Seeing well-being as a skill is a simple but very radical idea, which we think has extremely important implications. We also see well-being as an urgent public health need. This world today, even pre-pandemic, but now it has been significantly exacerbated by the pandemic, is a world in which there is a fundamental crisis of well-being. In a recent study with a very large sample here in the United States, this is pre-pandemic, 76% of Americans reported themselves to be moderately or significantly lonely. We also know that loneliness is a risk factor that actually trumps obesity in its impact on mortality. And so this is something real that gets under our skin and impacts not just our mental health, but our physical health as well. Just to give a few other examples, we know that depression is really skyrocketing, and it's been tremendously accelerated by the pandemic. Over the last 5 years, according to the CDC, the rates of depression have increased by about 33% among females, particularly, more so than males. And if you look at teenagers, those rates are higher in teenage girls, and they are an important risk factor for suicide. We know today, excuse me, in the United States, there's more than one teenage suicide every day. We also know that there's more than one physician suicide every day in the United States. And according to the World Health Organization, depression is now the leading cause of morbidity worldwide. So these are serious problems that require that we address them upstream and that we build into our lives in a meaningful way strategies to cultivate well-being. One of the things that I frequently remind people is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I'm sure that every person who is joining us today brushes their teeth, probably a few times a day. And we do this because it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And pardon me if there are any dentists who are listening today, but I think most of us would agree that our minds are even more important than our teeth. And yet we often don't cultivate our minds, don't treat our minds with the same respect and the same care that we allocate to our teeth or other parts of our physical health. And one of the things that scientists have learned particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, is how intimately connected our minds and brains and bodies are. And there's bidirectional communication that is occurring. This is really the set of mechanisms that are responsible for why it is that well-being or that challenges to well-being actually get under the skin and impact our physical health in addition to our mental health. So one of the ideas which is central to all of this, which probably most of you have heard of, is neuroplasticity, the notion that the brain is constantly being shaped by experience and by training. Our brains are being shaped wittingly or unwittingly. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly by forces around us, of which we're only dimly aware and over which we have very little control. And that's just happening all the time. And the invitation in this work is that the very same mechanisms that are responsible for a lot of human suffering can be harnessed for the good. And the amazing fact is that we scientists have discovered that when we nurture positive qualities in our mind, it actually affects our brain. It changes our brain, and it can even change our brain structurally, not just functionally, in ways that we think underlie the enduring transformation in well-being that can occur. So I want to mention something that actually pertains to, I caught the last part of David's discussion, and we just recently published a paper that actually bears on this. One of the other foundational disciplines that underlies this work is the science of epigenetics, the science of how our genes are regulated. So we're all born with a sequence of base pairs that constitute our DNA. And for the most part, that won't change over the course of a person's life. But what will change is the extent to which any gene is turned on or turned off. And one of the important findings or insights that has occurred, which I heard David mentioning, was work on our epigenetic clock and epigenetic signs of, or epigenetic indicators, markers of aging. If you look at the relationship between chronological age and epigenetic age, if you take tens of thousands of people, you will see that they're highly correlated, which is what we'd expect. However, some people show signs of epigenetic aging that are occurring more quickly than their chronological age. So in essence, their biology is aging more quickly than their years of age. For others, their epigenetic aging is occurring more slowly compared to their chronological age. And we ask the simple question as to whether meditation practice can actually influence this process, and whether long-term meditators in particular are younger epigenetically than would be indicated by their chronological age. And this is a paper that just came out last year, and we indeed found among a group of long-term meditators that they showed signs of epigenetic aging that were occurring more slowly compared to age and gender match controls. And while it's certainly not definitive proof, because We don't have longitudinal data in these people. It is an important data point in raising the possibility that these strategies are really important for not just promoting well-being, but they're strategies that actually can impact our biology in very significant ways that affect the rate at which we age and other aspects of health and disease. So I want to now turn my attention to a framework for understanding well-being that has been central to the work we do in our center, and also central to strategies that we've been deploying to disseminate this work widely. And I should just share one anecdote with you. One of the blessings in my life has been a very long-term relationship with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I first met the Dalai Lama in 1992, and pre-COVID, we were seeing one another typically 3 or 4 times a year. He has had a profound influence on my life. And in the late 1990s, during one encounter when I was with him at his residence in Dharamsala, India, he gave me what I consider to be the assignment for the remainder of my time on this planet. And what he said to me is this. He said, I want you to take the practices from my tradition, turn them into a form that anyone would feel comfortable doing, so that they would be more secular, if you will, more universal, so that people from any faith tradition or agnostics or atheists, anyone would feel comfortable engaging in these practices. Test them with the tools of rigorous science, and if you find them to be valuable, disseminate them widely. And that is what I feel my role is on this planet for the remainder of my time. It is an assignment that I embrace with tremendous joy and enthusiasm, because I do believe that these are strategies which are simple, which don't take much. They can be started very modestly, and they could be of real benefit. I have the conviction that if a very large percentage of people spent even as short a time as we do each day brushing our teeth, if we spent that same amount of time nourishing our mind, this world would be a very different place. So let me share with you what this framework for well-being is. The framework for well-being is the sweet spot. It is the intersection of what we know from modern science and what we know from these ancient traditions that the Dalai Lama and others like him come from. The sweet spot of pillars of well-being that exhibit plasticity. That is, these are the trainable elements of well-being. So the first element is awareness. And this is where mindfulness would be included. It refers to our capacity to regulate our attention, and also something that scientists call meta-awareness. What is meta-awareness? Meta-awareness is knowing what our minds are doing. How many of you think you know what your minds are doing? Now, that may seem like a bit of a strange question, but let me ask you, how many of you have had the experience of reading a book where you're reading each word on a page, and you may read one page, you may read a second page, and after a few minutes, you have absolutely no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. I've certainly had that experience. That is an example of us not knowing what our minds are doing. And in fact, a famous scientific paper that was published in the journal Science, which is a very prestigious journal. This was from a group of psychologists at Harvard. It was published 10 years ago with about 3,500 people across the world. And they asked them 3 questions using smartphones. taking advantage of the fact that most people have smartphones, and they asked them 3 questions. The first question is, what are you doing right now? And they had to check off from a list of activities. The second question is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, right at this very moment, how happy or unhappy are you right now? And here's what they found. The average adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. And when they were not paying attention to what they were doing, they were significantly less happy, even if what they were doing was boring, like washing the dishes. The title of this paper was "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And folks, I have the strongest conviction that we could do better. 47% is a crazy number. And if there's one thing we know about these simple methods for training our mind, is that we can become better educated in our attention. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar of well-being is connection. Connection is about the qualities that are critical for healthy social relationships. Qualities like appreciation, kindness, gratitude, compassion, empathy. Those are all trainable skills. They actually can be nurtured and cultivated. And one of the cool things that science has discovered is that when we are born, very young infants, before the age of 1 year, show a strong preference for pro-social encounters. Encounters that are warm-hearted, cooperative, altruistic. This is our basic nature. And when we see evidence of greed and selfishness, those are learned behaviors that are sitting on top of a basic core that is fundamentally pro-social at its roots. We can get back to that by nourishing it and nurturing it. The third pillar of well-being we call insight. And insight is about having insight into the narrative that we all have about ourselves. We all carry around a narrative about ourselves, this story that we tell about ourselves. At the very extreme end of the distribution, there are people out there who have a very negative self-narrative. They have very negative self-beliefs, and they actually hold those beliefs to be a veridical description of who they are. And of course, that's a prescription for depression. And well-being is associated not so much with shifting the narrative, but with shifting our relationship to this narrative by understanding what this narrative actually is, which is really a bunch of thoughts. And if we can appreciate what this narrative is, that it is composed of these thoughts, and understand how these thoughts shape our experience of others and the world, this kind of self-knowledge, this insight, is dramatically helpful in promoting well-being. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. And purpose is about finding our true north, finding our sense of direction in life. And most importantly, it is about aligning more and more of our everyday behavior around our sense of purpose. Can we envision a life where taking out the garbage is actually part of our sense of purpose, where everything becomes part of this central purpose? So those are the 4 pillars of well-being. Just to mention them again: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. Each of these pillars is trainable. Each of these pillars can be exercised with simple exercises. And it could be done not as formal meditation, but we can actually do it as we're engaged in other activities of daily living. We can do it while we're walking, while we're commuting, while we're actually doing physical exercise. We, as part of our center, we have a nonprofit that we've spun off. And through our nonprofit, we have released an app that is freely available to the world. It's called the Healthy Minds Program, and it contains practices and didactic content on all of these 4 pillars of well-being, and actually allows people to measure where they are and see how they change over time. And for those who might be interested, I would encourage you to explore. You can go to the website tryhealthyminds.org, all one word, tryhealthyminds.org, or you can just download the Healthy Minds program wherever you download apps, and it's totally free. So I want to end by just sharing a little bit about some of the other implications of this view, which I am presenting. One of the implications of this work, and one of the things that I've been implying, is that we can train well-being, we can see a measurable impact on direct measures of well-being, but there are distal consequences of the cultivation of well-being. One of them is for physical health. There is more and more epidemiological research that indicates that people who report higher levels of well-being are indeed physically healthier. And there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that in workplace settings, in corporate settings, programs to cultivate well-being can actually reduce healthcare costs. There's not a lot of evidence for this, but there's a little bit, and I don't want to oversell this evidence, but there is a little bit. Now, if it turns out that the cultivation of well-being indeed results in improvements in physical health and decreases in healthcare costs, this has obvious, profound implications, and every workplace setting on the planet is going to want to incorporate these strategies into its workforce. The second, which is so importantly relevant to issues in our society in the US today, concerns implicit bias and the tendency among many of us to have in-groups and out-groups, and to differentially relate to people in our in-group versus our out-group. We've done research with public school teachers where we've explored questions related to this. And this is so important in the US today because, as I'm sure all of you know, there's a huge achievement gap in academic achievement between Blacks and whites in America today. And the evidence shows that one of the most important driving forces of this achievement gap is what educators have called a disciplinary gap. And the disciplinary gap is the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment toward members of racial outgroups. And this is a product of implicit bias. And so if you asked on a questionnaire for the vast majority of these teachers, are you biased in any way? They would say, of course not. But I guarantee you that if we brought them into the laboratory and gave them sensitive measures, we would see evidence of implicit bias. And so the question is, does the cultivation of some of these pillars of well-being result in reductions in implicit bias? And these are behavioral and biological measures. They're not self-report measures. And the evidence shows that we indeed can reduce implicit bias, and these reductions can stick. They can persist over time. And we've shown this in public school teachers. And this, we think, is really important. We are also working with police, where we're engaged in similar kinds of programs. And we critically, I think, need something in our country today to help with these issues. So again, this is still at the very earliest stages, but there are many sectors of our society where these practices, I think, can be transformative. And I would encourage you all to please be part of the solution. The very future of humanity depends on it. And every person, I think, can play a really important part. And it begins with your own cultivation of well-being and taking your mind as seriously as you take your teeth and your body and nourish it every day. Because if you do, the data clearly show that we can become happier and healthier. So thank you all so much.
Well, Richie, thank you. It's always just so enlightening for me to hear, even though I've heard some of your messaging. I so appreciate hearing it again, because I think it reinforces for me the fact that, yes, we are in control of our own minds and our own destinies. And I love the idea of the narrative being here, and I don't have to, I'm not the narrative. I've created that narrative, or I can listen to that narrative, but I obviously can also step aside. I have a couple of questions. First of all, we're thrilled about the app. We will be sending out a link directly to the app to everyone who's on this call, so you don't have to go hunt for it. Meditation, when I first supposedly learned, and I know for a lot of people who know me well, they can't imagine that I could possibly meditate, but the idea that you could meditate or TM, transcendental meditation, twice a day for a minimum of 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, versus the idea that I can have your app, and I'm not suggesting one replaces the other, but for many people, they've never really been able to get their heads around, no pun intended, the idea of sitting for 15 minutes and not letting my mind wander, or letting my mind wander, but bringing it back. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I often say that the very best form of meditation that you do, that you could do, is the form of meditation that you actually do. So whatever may be working for you, if that's what you're able to do that on a regular basis, that's great. People often say that they can't sit still, they can't meditate, and my recommendation in those cases is for people to really start modestly, to begin with really short periods that actually can begin with 1 minute. Do 1 minute a few times a day. And if you find that's valuable, you can increase it. So we often, when we're working with a person, we ask them to please choose an amount of time that you feel you can allocate every day to this for 30 days straight without a lapse, even if it's as short as 1 minute a day. Just do that every day for 30 days and see how you're doing. And everyone can do 1 minute a day. And you can, in our app, as you'll see for those who use it, you can actually do all these practices as active practices. So you actually don't ever have to sit still. You can do them while you're walking. You can do them while you're running. You can do them while you're cleaning your house. You can do them while you're cooking, whatever you might be doing. And just listen in the background and practice as you're engaged in whatever activity it is that you're engaged with. And so we've had people go through the entire program without ever sitting for 1 minute still.
Richie, thank you for that. I'm so looking forward to using the app. We have a question from one of our members who asks, I find myself increasingly aware of my wandering mind. I'm wondering if I should be worried about aging and its impact on my mental clarity, or if my meditation and mindfulness practice is making me more aware of what has always been happening. Any insight or suggestions?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn, for that question. That means you're doing great. You know, when you do this kind of practice, you do become more aware of your wandering mind. The fact is, our minds are just crazy wandering all the time. And most of the time, we're so lost that we're not even aware of how much our minds are wandering. And when we begin to practice, we start to notice, and it actually sometimes can be a little bit anxiety provoking. And we've actually seen anxiety increasing some during the early stages of practice, not decreasing. And that's okay as long as it's not getting too extreme. And so my recommendation is simply, to the extent that you can, just acknowledge your wandering mind. Say, oh, make friends with your wandering mind. Oh, there is my monkey mind again. How nice. And you can give your wandering mind a little job to do, like pay attention to the breathing, or notice sensations in the body, whatever might be the sort of dominant object of experience.
Richie, can you talk a little bit about dreams as they relate to the wandering mind?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about dreams. There's so much to say there. One of the really interesting things is that, you know, if you put a person in a sleep lab and measure their brain activity and their eye movements, we know that unless there's a very unusual neurological disorder, everybody dreams several times every night. And most people don't remember their dreams. And yet, this is a very rich source of mental activity. And all of us can actually remember our dreams. Just like there's a lot of creative associations going on in our mind. And, you know, people sometimes say, well, I got this great insight when I was in the shower. And, you know, the fact is that that's probably the only time we give ourselves when we're alone and we're actually maybe paying a little bit of attention to what's going on in our mind. But if we became more familiar and cultivated our awareness, our first pillar of well-being, you would actually remember your dreams more frequently and potentially benefit from the insights that might be occurring. And you also could be more aware of the intrinsic creative associations that we all have, but we are so unaware of most of the time. One of the things I tell the graduate students and postdocs in my lab is to please spend at least an hour a week just paying attention to your own mind. Don't read, just sit there and notice what's going on. And you can have a little pad there and jot down, you know, ideas, but just notice what's going on. We don't do that enough, and our minds are such an extraordinarily precious resource, and yet we're so drawn to the external world, in part because there are masters of commandeering our attention that are in our culture, and it makes it more difficult.
The bright, shiny object.
Exactly.
You know, Richie, I could sit and listen to you, you know this, for the rest of the day, and I hope someday I have the ability to do that. I'm so grateful to you to sharing your time. I'm going to, I know that you're going to stay with us, and I'm going to pass the rest of this conversation, or the beginning of this conversation, over to Meryl Comer, who is WHAM's global chair and a dear friend, who will introduce Dr. Lisa Mosconi, and then we'll come back and have a dialogue with Lisa, Richie, Meryl, and myself. And I also just want to welcome, talking about global, our dear friends from South Africa who are on this call with us. We miss seeing you. We'll see you after, but we miss actually seeing everyone in person, giving them a hug. the last time I saw Richie and David, as I said, was early February. And I'm thrilled to keep this tie and be able to at least continue in this virtual format. So Meryl, thank you so much for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm still stuck on the assignment to Dr. Davidson from the Dalai Lama. I think we all ought to pitch in and help. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lisa Mosconi. She's the director of the Women's Brain Initiative at Weill Cornell Medical College in New York. Hi, Lisa. Congratulations on your New York Times bestseller. I have it with me. It is the XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to maximize their cognitive health and prevent Alzheimer's. This was the best and worst of times to release a book, but it is definitely empowering. You have been listening to Dr. Davidson, and I just want to ask, the last time you and I spoke, and I can't get it out of my mind, you said that you can hold a plank position for 10 minutes. I'm sorry to start this way, but what is going through your mind? Are you thinking about science? What is your discipline? And can you comment on what you've heard from Dr. Davidson?
Gladly, actually, I was really inspired by the conversation and the talk. So I switched from planking to running, which works much better for me because I sit a lot, and running really helps me as a very strong stress relief therapy for me personally. And I have a little treadmill at home. So the first time I almost died, and I set a very reasonable goal for myself, like Dr. Davidson was talking about for meditation. I said, I'm just going to do 2 miles, and almost passed out. And now I can do 10 or more than that. And I'm really happy about it because I'm able to actually get in the zone. And that is my form of meditation. And I'm really, really excited Dr. Davidson mentioned the running meditation, because it was like, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking. At first, I have a really hard time. I get bored. I have to really push myself to keep going. But once I hit 3 miles, I'm focused on me. I noticed that my brain just kind of activates itself. It literally, I don't know how to really describe it in a reasonable way, but it's like my brain literally turns on. And it used to happen with me also when I was planking, because at some point you have to let go of all your resistance, your aversion, everything else that's going on in your mind. You just basically focus on you and your body and your breath. And I've been practicing meditation. I'm not great at it, but I've been trying to practice this for many years. So I'm really happy to try and combine the two things, because I find a lot of us spend a lot of time sitting. So if you tell me you have to sit even more, I'll have a really strong negative reaction to it. Whereas if I can meditate while I'm doing the dishes, I find that very rewarding, like Dr. Davidson was saying, because that makes doing the dishes pleasurable. It's actually a moment that I have for myself, because I can tell my daughter, honey, do you want to wash the dishes? No, then don't talk to mommy. And that's 5 minutes that I'm actually in the moment. And I find it incredibly rewarding. I think of meditation a little bit like exercise. There are many different forms and types, and it's really important to find the one form and type that really works for you, that makes you happy, that resonates with you, and that is sustainable over time. And I'm really happy that we're talking about meditation from a scientific standpoint, because for so long, a lot of scientists were a little bit dubious, perhaps, about meditation as something that could be scientifically validated in the first place, and that also really had effects on brain health.
So let's talk about brain health, because
let's do it. Stop talking about running.
You have the luxury of speaking to a very sophisticated audience. So let's assume we know the basics. We know what we should be doing. We really want the latest research and interventions that really help to enhance our acuity, our memory, our cognitive skills. You know, I just noticed that there are 58 million baby boomers in 2020. The oldest turned 74. So at any of those ages, can we in fact enhance our memory? What do you think? And let's look at women specifically and what you found.
Yes, let's do it. And I think it's really important that we talk about women and women's brains, because I believe it's not widely acknowledged that women's brains age differently than men's brains in some respects, and that our menopause and the hormonal changes that take place in women really impact the way that the brain ages. So specifically for women, strategies and interventions that are aimed at improving overall cognitive health and mental well-being should also really take into account the unique and specific physiology of women's bodies and women's brains. And this is something that we've been trying to really explore and develop more in a research at the Women's Brain Initiative, but I have been personally looking into this for 20 years. Basically, I started as soon as I could, because I have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, and I come from a family of many, many women. So I really dedicated my entire career to studying and better understanding women's brains and how we can protect them for the long term, and what kind of factors lead to Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline in women and men, but mostly women, honestly, and what kind of factors can lead away from it. And I've seen a growth of studies and so much more attention and focus being given to gender medicine just in recent years that finally allow us to come up with very specific recommendations, right? So what should we do? What are the things that really work, and what are the things that maybe it's not great or worth investing into?
So let me ask you, because we're now about 8 months into COVID.
Oof,
Burden
yeah.
dynamics of stress on the brain. What are the manifestations, and are the culprits the high cortisol levels that get women in trouble?
Yes. Well, so stress has been defined as the silent killer in our population, because it's really quite pervasive. It's involved in a number of conditions, medical conditions, psychological, psychiatric conditions, and it's really hard to pinpoint what is really stress and what is something else. But I think the overall understanding right now is that stress is bad for you. Acute stress is a normal physiological reaction. It's a protective reaction, but chronic stress has very serious health consequences that affect the body as much as the brain. And what we don't talk about enough, I think, is the connection between high levels of stress and brain health. And this is an important conversation that turns out to be even more important for women. For example, there are new studies that use brain imaging techniques, like brain scans like magnetic resonance imaging and positron emission tomography scans, which is what we do, and studies of thousands of people in midlife, so 40 to 65 years old, have shown that high levels of cortisol, which is the main stress hormone, can really negatively impact memory performance already in midlife by the age people are 48 or 50. And that very often the high cortisol levels are associated with brain shrinkage already in midlife. And when these studies eventually broke the data down by gender, it's some kind of afterthought, right? We're always looking at gender as, oh, something I should actually kind of correct for or adjust by. But when they actually broke down the data by gender, they showed that the brain shrinkage was taking place only in women's brains and not men's brains at the same level of stress, which really suggests that the effects of chronic stress are even more severe for women's brains than men's brains, at least in midlife. This is something that is really important to consider, because stress comes for a number of reasons, but official statistics show that women tend to suffer higher levels of stress than men, specifically in midlife, between the ages of 35 and 50, which, not for nothing, coincide with the menopause transition, which is definitely a big stressor for so many women.
In your book, I always check your series of, we look at depression.
Yes.
And if you say that if you have 18 or more of these symptoms, you need to see your doctor.
Yes.
Or less, well, you can manage at home. Tell me about the self-awareness. Do we have self-awareness about what's happening, or are we just trained to be stoic in life and just sort of push through? So we miss the signals that say, I need to go see Dr. Mosconi. I need to take better care of myself. What is going on there? Is that a dynamic that you see often?
Oh my goodness, all the time. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we're looking into that right now specifically. We know that women are very aware of changes in cognitive performance, and so are men, but women tend to report them more. In fact, the subjective awareness of a change in cognitive performance is the number one reason that women come to see us or they seek medical support or neurological advice, and is the number one reason for women to start thinking about Alzheimer's prevention. And what was incredibly surprising to me is that the way that we diagnose and characterize these subjective cognitive complaints is not quite, it's not out there yet. There's so much that needs to happen to really understand what's happening. And just to summarize a fairly complex picture, it looks like the hormonal changes that lead to menopause, and especially the perimenopausal transition, which is the hot flashes, the night sweats, the insomnia, the depression, the anxiety, the brain fog, the memory lapses, all the symptoms really can impact a woman's own perception of her cognitive performance. Now, the point is, when you go to your doctor and get tested, you are fine. And one reason being that the tests that we use were developed largely based on men, and women perform better than men to start with throughout the lifespan, regardless of menopause, just because of the way our brains are wired. We are just, on average, better at certain tasks, like verbal memory is better in women, multitasking is better in women, executive function is a little bit better in women when you're formally tested. Men are better at other things, like visual spatial tasks. There are gender differences. And so what happens is that women start up higher. And even if you decline by 1 point or 2 points, you're still average, you're still normal. But you are not yourself. You're not performing the way that you know you could. And so many women really worry. So the good news, as far as I can tell, is that memory performance and cognitive performance rebounds after menopause, usually between 2 and 7 years post menopause, and remains pretty much stable for most women over time. For other women, especially those with a predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, memory performance may not rebound, may remain lower but stable. For a minority of women, however, the memory deficits progress. And that's when eventually, over time, a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment may ensue. So I think it's really, really important to find tests that are more ecologically valid and really developed for women to tap into the concerns and the lives of women, because we need tests that are very specifically reasonable for women and for women's lives and women's brains. And then we need to see if performance stabilizes, plateaus, recovers, and when it doesn't, why not? This is what we're trying to do right now.
Let me ask you, we were talking earlier or listening earlier about genetics. Yeah. And reading your book, the idea was that genes are not necessarily our destiny, and the impact of the epigenetics, how do you balance that, and what do we do to improve that environment? It seems almost as critical as our genes.
I believe so too. Yes, because of my family history, my very early research, my PhD thesis, in fact, was on genetics. genetic mutations that are causative of Alzheimer's disease. And I was really relieved personally to learn that these genetic mutations that cause Alzheimer's disease are very rare. They are found in less than 2% of all Alzheimer's patients in the population. It's a very small fraction of people who unfortunately do have genetic mutations that cause and provoke Alzheimer's disease at a young age and run in families. But for the vast majority of people, 98% or more of the population, risk is really a compound effect of many different factors. There's of course a genetic background. Your genetics are part of you. They're the baseline. Basically, they set the tone for whatever is happening inside your body, but they do not dictate Alzheimer's. They're not your destiny, in that other factors can really turn off some of your genes and turn on others. And it's your lifestyle, your medical history, your environment, whether or not you exercise, whether or not your diet is healthy, whether or not you meditate, sleep. It's really your entire life that is quite beautifully talking to your DNA. All the things that get inside your body, whether physically or mentally or spiritually, have a very direct effect on cellular activity. And they act like epigenetic factors to turn on and off. They literally switch some genes on and off. And if you make the right choices, those nutrients and those endorphins and everything you're putting inside your body will directly go into your DNA and say, the bad genes that make me age faster, we're switching those off. And the good genes that keep me younger and healthier and support the immune system and reduce a number of issues, we're flipping those on. So and that's how your life keeps you younger and beautiful and healthy like you.
So on that point, that was the conversation we were having with our first guest, Dr. David Sinclair, about switching on and off, or actually reversing the aging, the biological aging. But we also talked about there's so many independent risk factors and the comorbidities that impact the brain: diabetes, metabolic disorders, obesity. When we looked at the metabolic changes, which is many times diabetes, Dr. Sinclair brought up the issue of metformin. And they've been looking at that for some time. What is your view on metformin?
I think it's an incredibly helpful medication to have. I also find that patients are often given metformin without any recommendations on how to change their lifestyle for the best. Like a family friend, for example, a diabetic, like long-time diabetic, was taking metformin consistently, and then he would go out and eat pizza and ice cream, and he was heavily overweight, never exercised. And there's only so much medication can do for you. It's not a miracle. I think it's just as important to also take a close look at your lifestyle and make all the changes that you can make before you take medications or in combination with taking medications, so that the medication actually has a chance to work. And specifically for brain health, there are some connections between Alzheimer's disease and diabetes, in that they both seem to negatively impact the memory centers of the brain. In fact, diabetes is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and also about 7% of all Alzheimer's patients are diabetics, which has been linked to worse outcomes in those patients. So I think that managing diabetes and really teaching society how to avoid it in the first place, right? In some cases, it's genetic, but for many patients, late onset diabetes is something that is really strongly related to your lifestyle and your environment and medical comorbidities, like you said. So it could be manageable the same way that Alzheimer's could be in large part prevented.
Well, we're looking at risk reduction and staying healthy until the science catches up. Another topic that was brought up was intermittent fasting. And it's become popular, and you address that in your book. Do you recommend it? Dr. Sinclair has his version. Is there a difference between how men do it and women should do it?
It's a really good question. I don't think there are any studies that specifically look at gender differences as related to intermittent fasting. I do wonder, because of physiological differences between female bodies and male bodies, and how our estrogens are very specific carb burners. So in terms of human physiology, I was not prepared to answer this question. So these are really literally the first thoughts that came to mind. But it's a wonderful question. I love it. So women have more estrogens, as we all know. Men have more androgens, like testosterone. A lot of people are not aware that estrogens have a very positive role on carbohydrate metabolism, whereas male hormones are much better at burning fat, which I feel is one of the reasons that these high-fat diets, like the keto diet, seem to work so well for men, although I have no proof of that, but it's just the thought. And I feel like intermittent fasting has effects on the glycemic index and your glycemic levels in the body. So what I'm thinking is that the way you break the fasting might be slightly different between women and men. I would think that women would need more carbs after fasting, but this is my own personal thoughts. With that, I also practice a form of intermittent fasting that is called sleeping. And I think this is a traditional way of looking at intermittent fasting, because like the other speakers were saying, tradition is really important. There's science, but then there's also everything we've learned from thousands of years of people being on the planet. And what we know is that there's no reason to eat too much. There's no reason to snack. There's no reason to eat at night. So it makes a lot of sense. And a lot of populations, very healthy populations, like the Mediterranean population, the Japanese population, the centenarians of the world, they have an early dinner. We eat with the chickens. We have an early dinner, and then we stop eating. By 6 p.m. you have your dinner, and then that's it until 7, 8 in the morning. That's 13, 14 hours. Then you don't need to eat, and your body has a chance to detox and really metabolize all the nutrients you put into it throughout the day. Your stomach doesn't have to work overnight. Your intestine is not overloaded. And that's when your brain can also start working, right? And controlling all these other functionalities. And then your brain has a chance to really rest.
So let's talk about sleep and the brain and why it's so important. I've read studies where actually the brain is washed.
Right, like a car wash
at night. Can you explain what happens? Why it's so important?
Yes, gladly. I find it fascinating, and I think we all are a little bit guilty of not prioritizing sleep, right? Especially in America, where productivity is the #1 goal. What happens is that sleep goes in cycles. First, there are different phases of sleep, one of which is called deep sleep or slow wave sleep, is phase 4, before we start dreaming. And that phase is just so important because it's literally the only chance that your brain has to stop controlling the rest of the body, which is completely inert, completely still, and really focus on itself. Because if you think about it, every other minute of the day, the brain has to be in control of you.
Sounds
something
like
you're doing. Yes, but it's true, right? I mean, even if you're just moving your feet, your brain has to control that. If you're tossing and rolling in your sleep, it's your brain that's making you move. So slow wave sleep or deep sleep is the only time in the day, which happens multiple times overnight, that your body is completely still, and all your brain needs to do besides keeping you alive is really clean itself up. And that's the stage of sleep where the lymphatic system really gets activated. And like you said, it's a little bit like a dishwasher or a car wash. There's literally cerebrospinal fluid that's been used as a jet of water, or a jet of fluid to clean up the different parts of your brain. And then all the waste products, the inflammation, when the cytokines go find your inflammatory markers and want to be able to get rid of them, all the waste products, even Alzheimer's plaques are being degraded during that stage of sleep. and all the waste products are then being flushed down out of your brain, and then you eliminate them in the morning. So we really need to prioritize sleep, because the quality of our sleep is not as healthy as it could be. A lot of people wake up multiple times at night. We call it fragmented sleep. And poor sleep quality has been associated with a higher risk of amyloid plaques deposition in your brain already in midlife. So I think it's really important to sleep. And I think the sleep meditations are a fantastic asset.
Do you think that's more true of women than men in terms of sleeping, because you're tuned to your children, there's a different sensibility when you sleep. It never, even as caregivers, sleep is a difficult issue. Yeah.
Yes, and there's actual scientific evidence from the American Psychological Association that sleep quality is worse in women than in men. Women consistently have a harder time falling asleep and staying asleep, and we're much more prone to waking up, especially women who had children. I think it becomes ingrained in your mind that as soon as you hear some noise, you have to wake up because you're not sure what's going to happen. And it's not like men don't help. It's just that our brains are wired in such a way that we're perhaps more easily woken up by things. And of course, it's not an absolute, but it does happen. And there's a lot of research on this. And also something that I think is important to acknowledge is the connection between stress and poor sleep, right? Which is one more reason why meditating is so important. Also, if I have 1 second, I wanted to mention that the reaction to stress is different in women than in men. And I was wondering if Dr. Davidson has looked into the different response of women and men to meditation, perhaps, because we know that men have this very typical fight or flight reaction that was literally studied and understood based on studies in men. Women were just not part of the research on stress forever, until finally a female scientist decided to look into that. And they found out that women have a very similar reaction to start with adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine just going everywhere. But then women have a very specific reaction that does not take place in men, which is a very selective release of oxytocin in the brain. And oxytocin is the love hormone, which makes you want to reach out and bond and cuddle and protect. And there are a number of evolutionary theories on why that happened. But the bottom line is that the fight or flight reaction is more for men. The tend to befriend reaction is very specifically female. Women need to reach out for stress to be reduced. And they wonder how we can fold that into maybe a meditation or some stress reduction techniques that take our physiology into account.
Lisa, thank you so much. And Meryl, thank you so much. I want to continue, Meryl, with this dialogue between Richie and Lisa. And I would love to hear Richie's response to Lisa on a couple of the items that she raised. I don't know, Richie, how much of your research, I know some of it has been focused through MRI studies on monks and on others, but how much of what Lisa is asking in terms of the differences between men and women and stress and sleep and meditation, perhaps the two of you could get into a dialogue on that one.
You're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. I first, thank you so much, Lisa. I love your work and really admire it, and so appreciate your ability to communicate science to the public.
My goodness, thank you. That could have made my day.
Very important. There's huge amounts of overlap and really interesting areas of association. Let me just pick up on a few. One is that there's increasing research. I'm sure you know more about this than I do, Lisa, that neuroinflammation is an important constituent of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's. And we know that one of the important risk factors for many chronic diseases is inflammation in the body. There is increasing evidence to suggest that certain meditation practices can have anti-inflammatory effects. We know that there are reductions in pro-inflammatory cytokines, and we've done this work ourselves and have shown reductions in several pro-inflammatory cytokines that we can measure in the laboratory during certain kinds of meditation practices. And there is some work which implies that the systemic inflammation that we see in the body may also be accompanied by inflammation in the brain. And as I'm sure you know, Lisa, and probably are using this, there are ways that we have now for the first time using positron emission tomography, a certain kind of brain scanning technique, to actually measure inflammation in the brain, in the human brain, non-invasively with what's called microglial activation. And that has been implicated in neurodegenerative disorders. And we know that some of the diseases which are associated with peripheral inflammation are also associated with neurodegeneration and with neuroinflammation. And so this is all sort of background to invite the possibility, we don't have the evidence yet, but that certain kinds of meditation practices, as well as more general lifestyle factors of the sort that Lisa was describing, may actually help to reduce inflammation in the brain, which we can measure and which may have very important implications for the expression of Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders. So that's, I'd be curious to hear your reaction, Lisa.
I agree with you completely. We're doing neuroinflammation right now. We just started the protocol, which I'm excited about. It's a little bit tricky to do the PET scans. They're a little bit more difficult to do than the standard PET scans, at least that I've been doing for a while. I find that fascinating, especially because there are links between neuroinflammation, really the immune system, and menopause as well. It looks like there are some components of the immune system that are directly involved in the symptoms of menopause that women experience, especially the hot flashes. So neuromodulation therapies could be helpful also in that respect. And we recommend meditation to all of our patients at the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic, which is led by Dr. Isaacson, and at the Women's Brain Initiative, which is led by me, but we work together. And we find that patients experience tremendous benefits. I'm not sure that we recommend the best type of meditation, but as long as they are meditating, we do see improvements also in pro-inflammatory cytokines, which we measure currently in blood. So I think that's another very attractive avenue of research for sure, especially I'm thinking in women with induced menopause. Because a lot of women, unfortunately, go through menopause because as a result of surgeries, especially an oophorectomy or a hysterectomy, where we know that those women are at a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease as compared to women who just undergo natural menopause. And these procedures are associated with inflammation. Naturally.
Very interesting.
Let me bring in a Harvard Business Review article that somewhat amused me at first until I started to read it. It was that stressed women need mindfulness more than men. So they cite that typically men do 1.5 things at a time, and women, we do 5 things at a time. Is it just wishful thinking that women are better at multitasking? Is there something going on in our brains that's different? And in fact, is multitasking, Dr. Davidson, such a good idea?
Lisa, I don't know. I'm happy to take that first, and then we can both. There's evidence to suggest that in most cases, the term multitasking is actually a fiction. It doesn't actually occur. If you literally accept that word for what it directly means, which is literally engaging in 2 or more tasks simultaneously. The evidence suggests that we actually rapidly oscillate between tasks or among tasks, and in most cases, there are costs to that activity. Those costs can be in increased stress on the system, in what some have called allostatic load, which is kind of a chronic elevation of stress biology, but also in terms of performance decrements in one or more of the tasks in which we're supposedly multitasking. So, I think that this is an issue which is unfortunately, I think, misunderstood a lot in the general public, and without a lot of very specific kind of training, I think in most cases, multitasking is really a fiction.
The conclusion in the Harvard Business Review was that it reduces productivity by 40%. That was their point. But Lisa, are there more neural connections between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere in the brain in women than in men? I mean, what are you finding now?
The findings are, in part, that our brains are connected different, they're interconnected differently. And I think that sometimes we use terms that are more easily understandable, like multitasking, to actually describe something that is quantifiable, like working memory. Right? So if we look at working memory, which is a standardized term that describes a very specific function, which is pretty much what Dr. Davidson was talking about, like the ability to remember that you're doing a number of things at once, then women do seem to have an advantage in that department. And that's been, and again, the term multitasking is colloquial and may or may not have a physiological correlate, but working memory has been looked at in more detail. And it seems to correlate with the fact that the connectivity of the brain is slightly different between men and women. And these differences are subtle. It's not like you can look at one brain and say, oh, this is a man or this is a woman. But quantitatively, when you look at hundreds and hundreds of brains, women's brains tend to have stronger, which maybe is not the best term, but statistically stronger connections between the medial temporal lobes and the frontal cortex. Whereas men have stronger connections in other parts of the brain. But these connections between the medial temporal lobes and the frontal cortex in women have been associated with working memory. And we call it multitasking or juggling, but the point is, when our brains developed a really long time ago, the men would go out hunting and developed a whole set of abilities that would lead to their survival. And women were in charge of raising children. And one explanation is that the medial temporal lobes are those parts of the brain that really make you more able to respond to the needs of your child. And there's more emotional reactivity in structures like the amygdala, or the hippocampus makes you remember information. And the fact that they're so strongly connected to the executive functions in the frontal cortex has been linked to improved parenting, literally improved maternal instincts or parenting ability, which may not translate to the multitasking thing in the Business Insider, but our brains are slightly different in terms of connectivity, which I think is something that's really worth exploring, because we need to support those connections, right? And maybe it's meditation that supports them and nurtures them, and maybe it's something else as well.
So Dr. Davidson, in your studies, the white matter and gray matter in the brain, with meditation, it's supposed to increase the white matter. Can you simply explain to us why that's important and the difference?
Sure. Well, the connection that Lisa was just describing between the medial temporal lobe and the frontal cortex, that's a white matter connection called the uncinate fasciculus. That connection actually is particularly important, we think, in facilitating emotion regulation. We know that the prefrontal cortex plays a very important role in regulating emotions, and that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, which play an important role in emotion and memory, are especially important. And we know that structural differences in that connection is associated on one hand with vulnerability to anxiety. Less intact connectivity is associated with increased propensity for anxiety. And we also know that this is one of the areas of the brain that appears to be strengthened with meditation. And so there are quite a few published studies now showing that both the structural integrity of this pathway as well as the functional integrity is enhanced, particularly with longer term meditation practice. It's not something that can change overnight, and I certainly want to be careful in not implying that these structural changes occur quickly. They don't. But with longer term meditation practice, there are indeed a number of studies now which show that these white matter pathways are strengthened. And the white matter is the primary part of the brain that connects one part of the brain to another. It is the super highways of the brain that enable different parts of the brain to be interconnected.
The bottom line, are we persuading you, Dr. Davidson, that you should be studying women's brains as well? With Lisa, can we get something going here?
Well, let me be clear. We study women's brains and we study men's brains. We study both. And actually, you know, we became well known in the media for work we were doing with monks because a picture of a meditating monk was on, from our lab was on the cover of National Geographic with you know, full set of electrodes on the head. But the fact is that in that study, there were an equal number of women who participated. And so we do study women, and I certainly, you know, I love the work that you're doing, Lisa. And clearly, I think that it has been such an extraordinary bias in scientific research, both at the animal level and at the human level, I should mention, in favoring work on men, and it needs to be redressed and corrected.
Thank you,
And
Richie.
I think it.
Lisa, you wanted to make a comment. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was saying that it would be wonderful to know if there's a type of meditation that works even better for women than other type that works even better for men. Or even if just different parts of the brain get activated and strengthened more in one gender than the other. I just find it to be such important information because meditation is such a practical tool. Like you were saying, Dr. Davidson, before, anyone can meditate. It could be 1 minute, but then you can meditate for 20 minutes and really make a strong positive difference in the health of your brain. So I think that would just be, I would love to know that there's a type of meditation that works specifically for women, because I would be more inclined to actually give it a shot, honestly.
Yeah, and actually there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that compassion meditation may have stronger effects in women than it does in men. And that's been reported now in several different studies, and the impact of compassion meditation on pro-inflammatory cytokines and on cortisol has been found to be, in at least a few reports, stronger in women than it is in men.
How do you practice it? Can I ask? Is it in your app? Is it something that people can learn on your website?
It is, and it's very simple. I mean, just to answer the question now, very, very briefly, if you bring a person into your mind and your heart, and you often start with a person who is close to you, who you have an uncomplicated relationship with, a very close relationship, and envision a time in their life when they may have been having some difficulty, and just wish that they be free of that difficulty, they be free of suffering. And you can use a simple phrase like, may you be happy, may you be free of suffering, as you imagine them in your mind. And then you move on to different categories of people. So you can start with a person that's close to you, that you have this loving relationship with. You can move on to a person that you may not know very well, like a neighbor or someone who works in the same building you work in, and you see them on a regular basis. You can recognize their face, but you don't know much about their life. Imagine a time in their life when they may have been having some difficulty. And then finally, you move on to the category of person who we call a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons. And then you do the same thing in a very genuine, authentic way. And that is the key, because one meditation teacher has said that for every minute that you spend on the difficult person, it's like 100 minutes on the other categories. But you can do that, and that helps to increase the size of your in-group. And so, you know, someone like the Dalai Lama, I would say his in-group is every being on this planet. That's his in-group. There is no out-group.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Idea to do this, to actually connect the two of you. So we're trying to watch what happens. Carolee, we want to bring you into this conversation. It's yours. It's your show.
Well, no, I was so excited at the thought as we were putting this together of connecting in any case, and I know they will connect, Richie and Lisa, because I think there is a significant overlap in their work, or at least insights that they could benefit from one another. And so I'm always happy to do that. That seems to be one of my roles in life, is to act as the connecting dot. And I'm happy when that happens. You know, as I said, Richie, earlier, and Lisa, as I've gotten to know you, I could sit and listen for the rest of the day, but you know, unfortunately, we're on a timeline, and I'm going to show you a very brief video now, which talks a little bit about WHAM and the fact that we are, and thank you, Richie, for that acknowledgement, we are so focused on trying to shine a spotlight on the fact that women have been an understudied species for a long time. So if we can show that video, I don't know if we're set to do that. That would be great.
Sorry guys, 1 second for that.
It's still sharing your other screen.
No, it's
My name is Carolee Lee, and I am the founder and CEO of WHAM. When women are pulled from the workforce, either because of inadequate treatment options or because they are serving as caretakers for their family, there are economic consequences that are vast. WHAM is partnering with the RAND Corporation to produce a groundbreaking study that examines the economic impact on women, their families, their workplace, and the economy at large. What if we were to accelerate women's health research? What impact might that have? We're going to use this data to drive innovation and change.
Why does there have to be a choice? Sex, gender, and race can coexist as significant variables within the same studies. When we ignore these factors, we limit our science and our health.
We are basing our treatment paradigm on analyses and statistics that don't even apply to us.
I didn't know. I, of all people, should have known better. I'm an MD and a PhD and a woman, and I didn't know.
No business would make decisions based on information that excludes 50% of its customers. we shouldn't either.
With your investment by 2030, we will radically transform bias and inequities in medical research, accelerating the health, wealth, and power of all women.
Well, I thank everyone tremendously for joining us today for this extraordinary connection that we were able to make to these leading scientists and thought leaders. If you are a member of Access Circles, you're invited to stay on this webinar, and we will resume in just a few minutes for a private wrap-up session. If you're not currently a member but would like more information on becoming one, you can reach out to us at info@accesscircles.com. I certainly hope to see each of you again very soon, but most importantly, I hope you stay healthy, well, ageless, and meditating. And Richie and Lisa and David and Meryl and my entire team, thank you so much for making this such an extraordinary morning, one that I know we'll all cherish and remember.